Our next speaker is John Willis. John unfortunately can't be with us today as he has had a family emergency. He is the CEO and founder of Bochagaloop Technologies. His IT career spans well over 40 years, including time at a number of open source focused DevOps related companies like Canonical, Chef, co-founding Socket Planet, and Docker. He is the co-author of the DevOps Handbook and Beyond the Phoenix project. He has likely spoken at more DevOps Day conferences than anyone, and is frequently looked as one of the prominent voices of the DevOps adoption and the evolution of practices like DevSecOps. Because he's not here for the Q&A, I would suggest you ask all your questions via Twitter, and his Twitter profile link is going to be set up in the chat.
My name is John Willis, also known by Bochagaloop, and you can find me at jwillis@redhat.com these days. So this presentation is called Qualitative Data Analysis for Digital Transformation. So let's go ahead and begin. Before we get started, for some of you who know me, I joined Red Hat last October. In fact, it'll be a year here in a couple of weeks. The gentleman to the far left there is Andrew Clay Schaefer. Him and myself are probably one of sort of 2 or 3, probably 5 pioneers that was originally involved in the whole DevOps conversation. Andrew helped me start the first DevOps days in the US. To the right of him is Kevin Baer, and he is the co-author of the Phoenix Project. I've known Kevin for many years. That's me, the short guy. And that's Jay Bloom. He's been working with Kevin for years. Jay is our sort of resident PhD. He has a degree in design transition from Carnegie Mellon. So really well-rounded team. So we were brought into Red Hat to see, it was sort of think about like the first 10 years of DevOps. We've done a great job as a community. A lot of the 4 of us, including a lot of other people, were involved in a lot of the conversation of the last 10 years. So, but in 2020, how do we think about the next 10 years? Should we be thinking about doing a better job than we did in the first 10 years? And so I think a lot of what we think about is that. And so anyway, Andrew likes to say we wrote some books. Kevin, as I said, the Phoenix Project co-author. I've written probably over the years now, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 12 books. A lot of them nobody's ever heard of, IBM Red books. But the DevOps Handbook is probably the one I'm probably most known for, collaboration with Gene, Patrick DePar, and Jess Humble. I also did a labor of love project with Gene called Beyond the Phoenix Project. Andrew's written chapters in both the web operations, site reliability, and I had influence on the Unicorn Project. I wasn't an author, but I've sort of worked with Gene sort of as an advisor for many years around that. And then myself, as I've showed you some of the things, a couple of things that of note, I would say the handbook and Beyond the Phoenix Project, but I also worked on some really interesting reference papers over the years, and one that I've been real passionate about is DevOps Automated Governance. So if you look me up, you can find a fair amount of presentations I've been doing about DevSecOps, automated governance, automated cloud governance. Plus, I've been doing this stuff for a really, really long time, 40 plus years, but I'm only sort of listing the last 10 years here. And I worked for Canonical, actually pre-OpenStack, so the first private cloud Canonical. And then I sold the company to Docker. I've done about 10 startups over the 40 years as well. Early in at Chef, sold the company to Dell. And then, of course, now I'm at Red Hat. And so one of the things, as I've, in our travels, in my travels, like what are the things that I've learned about sort of, let's just call it transformation? Like how do we get people to change at scale? I would say it's relatively easy, and I double quote easy, to help somebody sort of DevOps, right? Like there's enough literature, enough books that if you're, a reasonably intelligent person, you can go in and sort of change a couple of value streams and automate them. The question is, how do you get a company to scale? How do you get a company that's, 100,000 people? And I've found that sort of that brick wall getting sort of like maybe less than 15 or 20% penetration of these sort of DevOps-y things, and getting to like 60 or 70% has to do with primarily these 3 things. And then I'll talk about each one of them. What I call sort of premature frameworks, or an impersonal approach, and mental models. So, this is something I've been saying over the last couple of years is you can't lean, agile, safe, or DevOps your way around a bad organizational culture or bad organizational behavior. And so, although, and I'm calling things like lean value stream mapping, a lot of tools that are very effective, as I'm just calling frameworks, but you're agile, you're all these things, right? The question is, these are incredibly good tools at the right time. One of the problems I find is if you go in sort of premature with these tools and you don't really find out, what's really going on, what's the gap, and it leads me to the second thing is, a lot of times, the sort of quote unquote experts, DevOps experts or the DevOps or the digital transformation experts will come in and say, well, I'm smarter than you, do these 5 things and everything will be great, right? And the truth of the matter is, I've got this from Christina Maslach. She's like, I've gotten to know, she's one of the leading burnout. So I've done some presentations and research on burnout. And I did an interview with her one time. And I just took this quote she did in the interview when we talk about burnout, but I think it applies here to the wrong approaches that we take, in fact, this impersonal, like, I know better than you, do these 5 things and let's see what happens. And she said, whenever we're talking about any kind of change or improvement, you are counting on a bunch of human beings to change and make this happen. If they haven't been part of figuring out how to do it, the change efforts will be dead on arrival. So you have to include the people that you're trying to change in the conversation. So this notion that some expert team will come in and basically, say, do this, do this, do this, and, and just tell everybody, hey, we're doing these things. Typically, it doesn't scale. And then the third important point that, going back to sort of 3 things I think why organizations can't scale these sort of transformations, or, we'll go back to Peter Senge, right? The 5th discipline author, or some people might say that, sort of the father of systems thinking, about mental models, right? And so these mental models, he says, mental models are deeply held internal images of how the world works, images that limit us to familiar ways of thinking and acting. Very often we are not consciously aware of these mental models or the effects they have on our behavior. So, I'll use the example of sort of in criminology, right? Like if you take 3 witnesses that saw a crime and, one will say the person had red hair and the other person said they had blonde hair. I've even done this where I've taken 3 people on the same service team, put them in 3 different rooms and had them map out the service that they manage. And you wouldn't be surprised that they were significantly different, right? So we have this thing about mental models of, how I think about the representation, the beliefs, the premises, even how we operate. What do we think the sort of the goal of the organization is? And so, so one of the reasons why I've sort of come into this idea of qualitative analysis is I think it is a reasonable scientific approach to unbundling these 3 things that usually, I think, get in the way of a transformation. So when we talk about qualitative, right, the first question that comes up is quantitative versus qualitative. And so there's been a lot of work in our industry, DevOps surveys by a number of organizations and companies, most notable the DORA and then Accelerate, which has been fabulous work. But just to put it in perspective, a quantitative approach, like say maybe a survey or a psychometric survey, starts with a generalized theory and uses correlation to draw specific conclusions. So it's deductive, right? It draws conclusions from general principles. It's mostly numerical, right? So a lot of stats, math, statistical analysis. It is impersonal, right? So the surveys are your best chance for asking questions to try to pull out. And again, great, people who are experienced in psychometric surveys are really good at getting quality statistics using statistical analysis based on the questions, right? But at the end of the day, they are impersonal. You are not able to have that sort of human-to-human conversation regarding the question. And they're close-ended. They're typically, not always, but Likert score, strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. So, and the thing that, I think when you're sort of doing qualitative or quantitative analysis, you typically start with sort of industry doctrine. So one of the things that in a lot of the sort of DevOps surveys, the sort of quantitative approach has been these sort of 4 variables: lead time, deployment frequency, change failure rate, and time to restore. So the theory was, going into, so I think it's like 6 or 7 years now, some of these reports are run, is that depending on how you address some of your behaviors and some of your technology choices, that high-performing organizations will be 100 or 200 times better at lead time, deployment frequency, and time to restore, and sort of lower in change failure rate, right? So that's the theory. You collect a ton of data, and you try to sort of prove out that, and if you look at most of the reports, they do sort of identify high, medium, and low performance. And so here's an example. How often do you deploy code? More than 6 months, between 1 month, between 1 week, right? So you get the point, or on demand. And this, again, get a lot of information, but here's the question. What if it depends? What if I actually have, multiple value streams where one is on demand, the other one's once a week, right? What if it's sort of like, there's that, again, that sort of like beautiful or terrible answer of it depends. How does somebody, it's sort of close-ended, right? Like you've got to pick one, right? And so, the idea of sort of quantitative approach with the pros is it's easier to administer. You get a lot more data than a qualitative approach. We'll talk about that in a second. It is definitely objective, and it's sort of at its core using scientific method, right? The cons, however, though, are it's impersonal. Like I said, you can't, you can't. So I'll show you an example here in a second, but you can't sort of ask somebody, what do you think that means? Or somebody can't ask in the question, like the word risk. What is, I've done a lot of research and work with organizations where, some people call risk, governance or compliance, and it's a sort of mixed bag. Same thing, close-ended, right? And it is definitely theoretical, and like I'll show you in a few minutes, a qualitative approach tends to be empirical, and it's context sensitive, right? Again, going back to sort of what I don't know as the person designing the survey, how you're going to interpret the context of the question. So now a qualitative approach, which I've found, I've tried everything, right? So this is sort of where I've landed in 2020 on how I think, right or wrong, how I think an approach, has been working really well for me. And the qualitative approach, it moves away from the sort of theory driving the data to approach where the data drives the theory. So what you're trying to do is, I think, all of us, right, we have industry doctrine. We sort of know what, like, if you go in the door of a large financial bank or something, if you've been doing it long enough, basically what kind of problems they're going to have. And you generally have sort of patterns and practices of solutions. And what you try to do, or I try to do in a qualitative approach, is try to not make any prejudgment. It's hard, but try to just ground up the data. And we'll talk about that. So it's an abductive process, right? Inductive, abductive, right? Draws general principles from specific instances. There's a sort of a category, you're trying to create categories of information. So you're listening to multiple people tell you multiple things. Typically, as opposed to a survey, one of the approaches in qualitative is interview, right? Group interviews, individual interviews. It's interpersonal, right? So if I ask you a question and I see a weird look on your face, I can ask you, hey, did you know what I mean? Or the person answering the question to say, hey, what do you mean by this? And you can have, sort of a human-to-human interaction to drill down on the interpretation, which again is open-ended, creates open-ended conversations. In fact, most times when I'm starting these conversations, I just simply get a group together, and I'll say, what is your company not doing that it should be doing? And that just sort of explodes into incredible discussions about, sort of governance and automation and toil. And so, for example, I've been doing these presentations called the 7 Deadly Sins of DevOps and this is just 4 of them, or 4 variants of them. But I, for my approach, the industry doctrine is that most organizations have, low levels of visibility. They can't see a lot of the work in the pipelines. They can't. There's not well-documented dependency maps. So there's a lot of coupling. My service requires the 3 services, and I don't really know, you know, I can't control the flow of those services, so I'm constantly in this variant state. I think recently I had an organization say, you know, one of our problems is we've got these dependencies, other sort of value stream or the service dependencies, and we don't know if they're going to return to work in 2 hours or 2 weeks. So imagine trying to create any type of flow when you have that kind of variance. And same consistency, right? Inconsistent environments, non-application of automation. It amazes me, you know, I try not to be judgmental, but it amazes me in 2020 to have, you know, a top 25 bank that still hasn't bought in on infrastructure as code for building infrastructure. Capacity, and then just a large. So these are sort of some of the ones that you know, clearly, like, okay, so that, like, you know, remember I said for sort of a quantitative approach, you're going to take those 4 variables. In a qualitative approach, I'm going to basically say industry doctrine is that there are these things. Let's find out if they're there. And so as an example of, you know, just very simple, you know, what is the audit process like in your organization? And, you know, and then, so a couple of things. One, I do get to interact, like if you want to sort of, you know, question me about, you know, like what audit, is it external auditors, internal auditors, right? Like, so again, I get to have an open dialogue about that. But more importantly, I get to aggregate the questions, right? So I start hearing person 1 says they're terrible, person 2 says they waste about 30 days, person 3 says we don't tell auditors things they don't already know. You know, and so I'm able to sort of ground up, do you know, sort of human-to-human conversations, but also I'm getting multiple answers to the same question in context, right? And so, so, you know, either in one conversation, and so you also have these beautiful side effects where somebody asks a question and somebody say, well, you know, sort of, you know, Bob, that's not exactly true. Like, again, you can't get that kind of dialogue. And then Bob's like, well, you're right, you know. But like, you can't get that dialogue in you know, in a survey. So the pros of you know, a qualitative approach is it is empirical. It's evidence. It's verifiable. You know, the verifiable evidence, right? Like I can sort of ask you and pinpoint or drill in. It's open ended, and as you saw in that last example, it's generally combinatorial. Like I can have multiple people, you know, correcting or adding value to the answer to the question. Certainly harder to administer. You know, that, you know, like in a quantitative approach, I can literally, you know, if I get it right, I can interview, you know, thousands of people. You know, the largest qualitative approach that I've done, you know, I'm sorry, qualitative approach that I've done is like 350 people, right? And that was like, I spent a month at a large bank. Less data, and it is subjective, right? But in general, like even the sort of quantitative approach is subjective, right? Like in other words, you're sort of taking your theory to sort of blend the data into it. So you do have, in either case, you have this sort of approach of industry doctrine. The other thing that I've come to find is there are some fabulous tools for qualitative data analysis, and I found this one too. So there's a whole category called computer-assisted qualitative data analysis. So typically, without sort of tools, you basically, you know, I bring like, you know, 10 color-coded highlighters with me, and I just start taking paper notes and highlight. Now what I do is I take, I do this, you know, this is called CAQDA. There's a couple of ones. I happen to really like this one. And you literally take the artifacts that you gather, mostly, sometimes recording, depending on if the company allows it, but always transcripts, and then sort of notes. And I like to have at least myself to catch highlight notes and a scribe, and then I have transcripts. So I'm actually using, you know, sort of a 3-pronged approach: the actual transcript, a scribe, somebody who's just taking notes in detail, and then I'm taking sort of highlight notes of really important things. And then you can add all that into the approach. And so one of the approaches I've taken, just get a little sort of academic here, or academia, is what's called grounded theory. So it's this is an approach where, you know, for example, you know, I have this data, I have interviews, I have transcripts, I have notes, and then I go through this computer-assisted qualitative data analysis tool where I actually code things. I'll show you an example. And then I start applying a methodology to concepts, creating a model and categories, and then I ultimately data drives a theory, so I try to validate there's somewhat of the scientific method here. And so the approach that I use as part of grounded theory is this work my way through coding. Coding is just, there's different sort of schools of coding, but generally you're identifying things inside the artifacts, the notes or the or the transcripts, and then you're working that up, sort of grounding that up to concepts of similar codes, and these tools also have amazing ways to add sort of context field notes, general field notes, and then you roll those up into categories that's basically driving your basic theory, and then in the end you have some sort of theory, which is how do you approach. So the sort of code concept, here's an example. Like code might be, I highlighted the answer to the question on audit. Like audits take 30 days a year and they consume a lot of time. The concept roll up is, I've heard this a bunch of times, through combinatorial sort of answers. Audits are inefficient. The category is risk. The theory might be, you should start thinking about applying automated governance, and so I told you earlier, I have this, my version of an industry doctrine, which is I call the 7 deadly sins of DevOps. I've got full presentations on this, but you can take a look at, any of my presentations. But you can see visible work, management system toil, misaligned the sentence. If you read the Phoenix Project, right, knowledge, alignment, the Brents, organizational design, understanding complex systems, and, sort of all funnels down to security and compliance theater. So typically, the engagements that I do, I wind up interviewing, depending, COVID time, they're all virtual. Pre-COVID, I used to do, go spend some time in an organization, have all-day meetings. That's where you get real value out of it. Spend a, team one on, a development team on Monday, a development team on Tuesday, an infrastructure team on Wednesday. So you get to sort of, it's really good when you start, by the time you get to the infrastructure team, you can ask questions about like, hey, are there any issues with, getting resources from software engineers and developers? And, the infrastructure team, no, why do you ask? I'm like, well, I've kind of heard from the developers that, that you cut all their sort of memory and storage requests in half. Like, of course we do. They're idiots, but in COVID time, I have to take what I can get virtual. So, but, so maybe 10 meetings or, like I said, the largest one I did was like 310 minutes. So the artifacts are like lots of transcripts, a lot of documents. And then, the analysis is that I go through then is I'm constantly sort of updating this CAQDA. I go back and listen if there's audio. I go back and sort of make sure I'm sort of coding and creating, sort of categories. So you see here, this is an example of one that I did where, I have the interview notes, I have recordings in this case, and then I have sort of participant notes. And then those are the artifacts there in the document system. And then you see on the left, there's a bunch of codes. And then I've got some categories that I'm building, like automate delivery outcomes. And then, the good tools allow you to do word mapping. Here's an example of sort of highlighting and coding things and then sort of, putting them with some type of name or, so I can say it's an impact or it's cost or it's toil. And then these tools also have really, really good tooling for, so one of the things you have to do, right? Like, so you get all this, like you've got, 20 documents, you have maybe a novel, like 100,000 sort of words of sort of information. And so what you try to do, the really good tools allow you to tease data in multiple ways. Like you saw earlier, the word map is a good way to start. Like, let me find out what the lexicon in here is and see, oh, they use this word quite a bit. And then I can, sort of also start thinking about, oh, let me start seeing what the data looks like from sort of graphically, right? So here's an example of just sort of playing around with sort of, okay, risk, consistency, knowledge, alignment, how do all the codes line up? Let me see, what the data, again, the whole thing is you're sort of trying to force yourself not to make judgments or opinions and then using these really incredible tools to see if the data is telling you something, as opposed to you trying to make the data fit a certain way. And then this is interesting because a lot of times the notes and the transcripts, like transcripts, so, sort of even the best transcriptors are, can't capture all the words. So this is one where you can, I'll go in and do a quick check on comparing the transcript to the notes and see where the gaps are. And then, so a lot of times the real, the stuff that people really get excited about is how we're doing with, governance, risk, and compliance. And so, start creating some graphs that sort of drill in on, what's, InfoSec, what's business, risk. And then finally, then what you're able to do is sort of aggregate that report. So you actually do get, a little bit of a quantitative here in that, quite frankly, what I wind up doing is, and probably the true qualitative data analysis scientists would actually get furious at me at this point, but I start looking at like how often, so if I've gone through this ground up process to categories, how often do I find instances in that category? And then I'm able to sort of look at like consistency just showed up way more than say capacity. Again, there's a subjective nature to it, but what you would hope is the analyst has a pretty broad spectrum of knowledge of the industry, and then they're able to create, pretty high percentage, subjective analysis, if you will. But in, here's a case where consistency, funding, and toil just seem to be top of mind of all the conversation in interviews. And so then, which this leads you to your sort of theory, your thematic observations, right? Like in a lot of cases, again, the sort of anti-patterns of DevOps turn out to be, relatively true everywhere, low trust, right? And so you have your centralized authorities, your cabs, all that stuff, right? So you're hearing it from the people doing the work. Like, I don't understand why we have to do a manual handoff to go from stage to prod. Like, can't we? There are other companies doing this like us, other banks like us can do this. Why can't we? All right. And so it's sort of really figuring out where that comes from. How do you arbitrate risk and policy? Lead time. Again, I think companies that haven't invested in full automation, why does it take 3 weeks in these modern organizations to get storage or, VM? I heard one recently, where it still takes 2 weeks to be able to use an Amazon instance, or too many active projects, right? Like that sort of, we've got all these active projects, and then somebody screams, we need something here, and then you pull a bunch of people off, and so you've got all these often projects. Clarity, people just sit there and tell me, like, they just wish they'd get more clarity from leadership on exactly what they want them to do, right? Like, instead of like sort of every couple of months, like we're changing the sort of game on them. They just feel like they're pawns being sort of, again, that's the beauty of like having these conversations with people, and they get to tell you, like, we can't make sense of this stuff. We start the year off with this grand plan, 4 months in, we're sort of, okay, no, we're going to do this with no explanation. And then, funding, definitely is, there's this notion of agile budgeting, which very few companies have really sort of figured out. So this idea of sort of your sort of yearly budget, you get this much money, it has a sort of a life cycle, and those that usually, so that's the problem is you can be like DevOps and Agile all you want, but if you're still waterfall budgeting, like there's a definite mismatch. Also, like I try to drive into economic impact, right? So I think this gets fun, right? Which is, let's look, one of the things you get to do again in a qualitative approach is you actually get to ask like impossible questions. Like, you say if you just spent a whole day with a team, or even like, like a lot of times when I'm doing this sort of group meetings, they're usually an hour and a half, 2 hours. They're much better when I'm on site and I got a whole day, but I find there are people that just have like really good input. So I'll ask if I can do a one-on-one with certain people that seem to be sort of just very knowledgeable, very transparent. And when I get those people on an interview, I'll ask questions like, so given everything we've talked about, what would you say the sort of aggregate amount of waste that goes on here, either through sort of service management or ITIL or sort of things that that sort of don't make sense or really don't help in their mind? And you'll get answers like 30 or 40%, right? And again, they're very subjective, but you're asking sort of leaders in the organization to sort of come up with a number. And what's interesting, I always feel sort of gun shy of asking that question. They're going to cringe. I cringe when I ask it, and then more often than not, they answer right away. right? Like, and that's an indication that it's pretty clear to them how much waste they're doing. I mean, they live it every day, so you look like at a $500 million budget. This is sort of, medium to medium small bank, right? Again, when we're talking about large enterprise and, Global 1000, like this is relatively a smaller budget. There's 150 million wasted on general process. And then, I think you can easily aggregate in lost opportunity costs for low or no automation, right? Like, again, if you're sort of manually building infrastructure and not using sort of Ansible or Terraform or whatever. And then there's this whole discussion that I'd love to learn more about, like, what is your cost of what I would call negative risk, or that means you're doing things that you believe are making you safer from a risk category, for a risk or a control point, risk control, but you're really not like making anything safer. And so you are then stealing time, opportunity costs away from making yourself safer. Like that has a scary cost, right? Especially if you're in a regulated business and you can be fined or suspended from areas of business. And so I play around sometimes, like especially in a financial institution. I've done this a fair amount of times with some banks, and so I sort of round the numbers up and down. So so it's generally anonymized, but basically categorically around the size of banks. So no bank on this slide is a real bank. They're sort of within range of banks that I've done, right? And I sort of look for like what are the things that you would want to think about comparison from an economic benchmark, like what's your revenue, how many employees, asset holdings could be interesting, but number of apps. And then the question was, if you've gone through some transformation improvement, what was your waste before and what's your waste avenue? And then it's sort of math, and then what you want to do is sort of apply generalized and specific theory. Basically sort of here's, all right, here's, we have some industry doctrine. We've gone through the qualitative approach, and now here's the things that are out there, but these are going to match what I heard. I would say one of the things I like about the approach is when you report back to the staff, it's like, I'm not telling this company X that you need to do things. I'm telling you from what I heard from the people that work for you told me these are the things you need to do, right? Usual suspects, site reliable engineering. I think those are the right way to do things, right? Increase your, automation, like that's just, DevOps 101. I do believe in, as we see here, in 2020, I think the sort of evidence is clear that not just because I work for a platform or a company that has a platform, OpenShift, Kubernetes. I think, platform engineering, platforms are the way to go. Containerized cluster management. You'd be surprised how many banks understand that. I've had a sort of large bank tell me that in banks, cache engineering is absolutely critical, right? So if you're if you don't understand how this makes you stronger, then be able to understand your skill set, right? We talk about I-shape, T-shape, E-shape. You've heard those conversations, right? What's the liquidity? Like if you're sort of moving around, if you're picking up technology, what you require in a company or you get acquired. DevSecOps, right? Like what is your pipeline? What is your sort of referenceable architecture for security? You have really sort of security embedded in all stages of your delivery, from an IDE plugin that identifies malware libraries, or, sort of vulnerabilities, all the way through sort of your scanning, your DAS, your SAS, your software composition analysis. Again, I would you just Google me and automated governance, automated governance. Done a ton of work here, reference architectures in the slide deck, and more recently doing automated cloud, which is really interesting. What a shoot of that. This really, it's about sort of leadership, culture, behavior. We mapping is like one of those framework conversations to talk about, which is an incredible tool that you must use. Like I said, I don't like to use it prematurely. I like to understand sort of the gaps in, like, do a qualitative approach, where your behaviors are, where are the things that you hear the most versus some others, and then look at value stream mapping or value chain mapping, which is wordly mapping you heard. Three economies, we've got some good work on looking at sort of platform engineering as broken up in three economies. Again, more on that. You can Google. Again, anything you have questions, Botchka-Loop, I can point you to really good literature. I am a huge fan of the Team Topologies book, which came out from IT Revolution. In fact, I've been using for a few years. I got an early copy of it like a few years ago. And so some of the stuff they talk about, team boundaries, cognitive load in team, norming and storming. It's just a great book that has really meaty research. So like they're telling you stuff and they point to the research. It's called team APIs, like how teams communicate, not technically, but social technically. And then safe to fail, psychological safety, all those kind of things. So basically, remember I talked about you sort of roll up data from codes, right? And you sort of get to sort of categories. So you find that there are certain categories. I won't go through all these, but these are sort of instances of categories. So like remember earlier, like if I find that sort of there's more things in consistency than anything else, then that might be the, sort of first place to look for solutions. Funding, different sort of financing, and then toil. Obviously, toil's usually everywhere, right? Like bottlenecks, whatnot, visibility, and then communication, different sort of clarity. How does sort of risk get translated to the modernization efforts, right? Frozen middle, risk, capacity, and then just sort of winding down here, this is, sort of a longer presentation, but what I usually do, again, going back to sort of, you start with a notional industry doctrine, right? So like in general, if you're going to do the interviews, you have in the back of your head that I want to tease out these, and I, typically think about the 7 deadly sins of DevOps, right? These patterns that seem to be universal as my frame of reference of how I'm going to try to have qualitative, interview conversations with groups and teams and individuals. And then you walk through the data to ground that up. It tells you what the categories are. And then, I have sort of industry doctrine on terms of how do you solve problems for organizations that are trying to do transformation. And as you can notice, I like the number 7. Again, I use it really sort of more for, it just makes presentations and keynotes, more attractive. They're just patterns. Like it could have been 6, could have been 9. But I find that, the areas where companies struggle is just taxonomy, right? Go back to that sort of open-end conversation and human. I can get a sense if different groups or individuals within an organization are using different words to describe the same thing. The sort of the criminology, red hair versus blonde hair, right? So I can sort of hone in on like maybe one of the first things or the easy things to get a hold on is let's create some common taxonomy. Let's make sure that sort of everybody here, like we know what the words we're going to use. In fact, one of the years ago, I remember Eric Ries, Lean Startup, had a conference and he was interviewing a fireside chat with Beth Comstock, who was the CMO of GE. And BE had bought into Lean Startup, in a big way, brought Eric Ries in. And then I remember seeing that, and about a month later, I was actually with one of my startups that I worked with, we were actually helping them implement a private cloud infrastructure. And I remember like all the people that were at the edge, the people who were doing the work, were using the same terminology. They were using, build, measure, learn, MVP, pivot. And I thought, well, what a beautiful thing for an organization. I forget how many employees GE had, but 100,000, 80, 90, 100,000 people. And imagine you get everybody using the same words and having the same context to those words. I talk about team topologies and models, roles and responsibility, really understanding how you want to transform to platform. It gets a little technical there, but like, for example, I think you had to be under a rock to not realize that sort of containers and Kubernetes or cluster management is sort of the right way to go. The cloud titans figured that out years ago. Outcome-based metrics. I'm a big fan of flow metrics. So if you haven't seen those, of course, automation. Really putting, in like sort of 1/7 of your emphasis on skills liquidity, not just skills update, not just onboarding, but how are you, I've seen really good examples of sort of gamification, where maybe a guild where you actually get, depending how often you presented the guild and what you do and sort of the net promoter score of those things actually go into your bonuses, make up your bonuses. Again, like, you want to sort of achieve skills liquidity, but you have to sort of put things in motion that are sort of out of the box and a little different than sort of normal. And then again, the whole safe to fail model is, again, really sort of important to understand. I'm getting near the end here. This is a longer presentation where typically I go through each one of these 7. There's a ton. I'll make these slides available. There's a ton of really good reference papers, forum papers we call them, that I've been working with Gene Kim and the IT Revolution for many years. So each one of these areas, the 7. Here's the 5 elements. I talked about sort of a Chinese medicine of balancing product and development, architecture and operations and leadership. Again, some good papers from IT Revolution. I'm the flow metrics. I think Mick Kirsten, his project to product, but I would say it's even sort of product to service, and then sort of platform as interface. So what you're trying to do is sort of collapse in operations and infrastructure, sort of right to left, and SRE and then 3 economies, and then you're moving sort of product focus to model focus, to get to sort of your sort of platform is that sort of thing in the middle, a clutch. And we call the 3 economies is sort of a scope economy in the middle of a differentiation and a scale. And I know I'm doing a disservice to that conversation by going through it so quick. Here's what I was talking about, the sort of 3 economy model. Typically we think about the world as a 2 economy model, right? And so this idea, like, sort of how can we sort of move things? Let's the developers just do developer things. Let's move all that stuff into the scope, and let sort of operations move the infrastructure scale things into the scope economy. And we think a lot about a platform as an interface as opposed to a platform as a service. Change management, and then here's some. I'll make this available. So some great papers, forum papers, ton of forums, like 60 or 70 forum papers out there. Dominica Diagranis, Making Work Visible, The 5 Thieves of Time, Mix Project to Product, metrics. I talk about flow metrics again. I think you have to have the common 4 that we talked about: lead, deploy, MTTR, or mean time to restore, change success. But I think you get, those I would say are latent. In other words, you don't really get to decouple them. But flow metrics actually includes sort of wait time, and you get to decouple, or change failure rate by team or work. And then here's some really good papers and books, automation. I talked about trusted support software supply chain. This is an example. I know I'm going really fast. Here's the DevOps automated governance reference architecture guide. Some of the papers in the automated cloud governance papers, skills liquidity, dojos, continuous learning, safe to fail, chaos engineering, like I said earlier, or there's this notion of continuous verification, sort of a variant in a chaos engineering. There's a chaos engineering book, and I just want to finish up. Anyway, that's basically it. Again, Willis at redhat.com, Botchgaloop on Twitter. If there's something you find interesting here, feel free to reach out. I'd like to have deeper conversations about this, or if you have some comments, or you think that, sort of I've gotten something wrong, or, or there's things I'm sort of missing, I would love to have that conversation with you. Anyway, thank you so much.
So, as mentioned before, John is not with us right now for questions, but as he mentioned himself in the video, you can reach out to him at Botchagaloop in Twitter. Please, I want to apologize for the small technical issues we had with the audio. We hope the message was delivered anyway. And as we have some time left for the next session, I would encourage you to join the networking sessions or visit our sponsors' stands. Thank you so much for attending this session.